Hills grasslands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As you know, there's a common practice here in Parliament to thank our constituents when one of us rises to speak for the first time after an election. There's obviously a good reason for doing it beyond having good manners. It acknowledges one of the most important truths about this place. The people who live in our ridings are the reason why we are here, whether they voted for us or for someone else, or even if they didn't vote at all. This is the House of Commons, and it belongs to the people. So I would still like to once again thank the constituents of Cypress Hills Grasslands for sending me here as their representative. With the great privilege of standing here today on their behalf, I must speak for them and for their families. I will always try my best to do so. It always takes time and effort to hear from different people, reach out to them, and figure out what they're thinking, feeling, and experiencing. Sometimes we agree, and sometimes we disagree, and that's okay. But this task is absolutely worth it, no matter what. If I disagree with constituents, that should not prevent me from honoring them with the courtesy, dignity, and respect as people and as fellow Canadians. In fact, it's when we are challenged with competing thoughts and ideologies that we often make the best decisions for our constituents and our country. As a song from my youth says, "Not a diamond without the pressure." That is what it means to be a member of Parliament. Everyone has a role in the democratic process, but elected representatives have a duty to make an extra effort. A beautiful part of our parliamentary system is that the same people who serve as the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers are also just members of Parliament. For example, the current Prime Minister was elected as a member for Papineau, and the Leader of the official opposition was elected as the member for Portage Lisgar. On either side of the House, they have to work in both roles at the same time. It remains true that before assuming public office in government, someone was first elected by the people of their riding to be their voice in Ottawa. That is their primary role. As ministers, they have simply added another responsibility to serve the entire nation, regardless of representation. But it should never change the fact that they are working here to represent the people of Canada to the government and not the other way around. If they ever forget it and become disconnected, they have completely lost their way. And I do believe that recent events so far show that we are losing our way as a nation. This point should be front of mind as we debate and vote on this government's emergency order. We have a perfect opportunity to remind a minority government that they should not be playing around with power. They should not be using the Emergencies Act to forsake their public responsibility. The Liberals need to come back down to earth. On Friday, with police action expected to begin here in Ottawa, the scheduled debate for the House of Commons was cancelled with short notice. I decided to go for a walk and look around the scene outside of Parliament for myself to get a sense of the situation at hand. As I did, I met a man who is proudly wearing military medals on his coat. He's a veteran who served our country overseas in Afghanistan. He told me that he made the long journey across Canada to be here because he's worried about the country that he loves, the country that he served, and he wants to stand for freedom. I thanked him for his service. I also talked to a school teacher that lives downtown, and she didn't feel threatened at all as she walked down near the front of the protests. She talked about how she used to be a big supporter of the Prime Minister, but can no longer support him because of his arrogance and lack of respect for other Canadians. What I saw and heard from these individuals was far from what the Prime Minister infamously called a small, fringe minority with unacceptable views. The disconnect was more obvious than ever, and it brought us some of the disturbing scenes in our nation's capital over the weekend after the Liberals invoked the Emergencies Act. The government's show of force has wounded our society, and this is likely to be the longest-lasting result of it. It's an outrage to see our Prime Minister invoke hateful rhetoric against those concerned for their freedoms, calling them a fringe minority and choosing to label them as racist and misogynist. Especially in difficult times, we need a Prime Minister who will put partisan politics aside for the common good. After all, the Prime Minister represents every Canadian. Every Canadian is one of his constituents. So for name-calling to be the first and only action taken by the government before using the Emergency Measures Act, it further shows the lack of respect he has for people who don't agree with him. There are many Canadians, vaccinated and unvaccinated alike, who recognize that Canadians should have the right to make medical decisions for themselves. After all, it is a change in the government's position on a vaccine exemption for truckers that has triggered all of this. Canadians should not have to face the question of taking a vaccine or losing their job. They should not be sent home from stores because they have not been vaccinated. They should not have to face a financial penalty simply because they're not vaccinated. Children should not be banned from playing sports because they are not vaccinated. no Canadian should have to face such dehumanizing treatment for simply choosing to not get vaccinated. That is not the Canada I grew up in, and that is not the Canada our children should grow up in either. Madam Speaker, you may recall that this past December, I rose in the House on behalf of all of those who lost their jobs and their livelihoods as a result of vaccine mandates. Following that statement, I received hundreds of emails from Canadians all across the country, sharing their personal stories, many of them devastating. I've heard from those who have lost their home because they no longer have a job or an income to pay the mortgage. I've heard from others who had to explain to their children that they could no longer join their friends at the hockey tournament. I've heard from students who are kicked out of their university programs. And more devastatingly, I've heard from parents who have lost a child to suicide and attribute the cause to lockdowns, to mandates, and to bullying. These people live in Liberal ridings as much as they live in mine, but does the government bother listening to them? It isn't enough for the Prime Minister to simply say, "We heard you," as an empty statement while clearing the streets. Vaccine mandates are wrong. They are morally wrong, and it's increasingly clear that they are a public policy failure. They are ruining livelihoods, clogging supply chains, stifling our economy, eroding medical privacy, and dividing society, all the while not living up to the earlier promises of defeating COVID. Why continue to act like they are a magic bullet out of the pandemic? Why continue to trample on protesters and Canadians' rights with little to show for it? When will the government finally take responsibility for their divisive policies, walk back their vaccine mandates, and actually consider a comprehensive plan to combat COVID-19, including access to therapeutics and increasing funding to provinces so they can ramp up ICU capacity? I'll also add that I believe an apology is due. An apology for treating those who are unwilling to get vaccinated or peaceful protesters as second-class citizens. They are not second-class citizens. They are as Canadian as you and I, and they are worthy of respect, dignity, and a listening ear. I also want to encourage NDP members to vote against the motion. Each time the War Measures Act was used, as the previous version of this legislation, it left behind wounds in our society after enabling real or perceived abuses of power. This is already turning out the same way. I don't expect to quote Tommy Douglas all the time, but I believe his precedent is worth considering. He described then Prime Minister Trudeau's use of the War Measures Act in Quebec as using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut. He stood on principle by voting against the grain at the time. There have been some misgivings in the NDP caucus about opening Pandora's box, but they say they want to fix it somehow with an inquiry after the fact. One of their former caucus colleagues, who served as a member for Regina-Louvain, even used the same quote from Tommy Douglas to challenge the current NDP's stated intention to support Liberal overreach. I hope they'll listen to their own people, even if they're from my province. Over the many hours of debate that I have sat in on, I've only heard a handful of Liberals even try to outline a reason for invoking the Act, and it is a stretch at best. Some tried to use the blockades around the country as the reason. Unfortunately for the Liberals, they were all mostly cleared prior to invoking the Act. Another tried to say they needed to compel tow truck companies to move some of the semis and vehicles. Once again, they are found to be wrong, as my colleagues from Haldimand, Norfolk, and from Perth, Wellington have already pointed to existing laws that provided that ability. The last reason they gave is to stop the foreign funding of the Freedom Convoy. This does not constitute a national emergency. Unfortunately for the Liberals, yet again, a couple $1 million donated to a crowdfunding campaign were halted without the use of the Emergency Measures Act. We have witnessed over $1 billion in foreign funding come into Canada over the last number of years to intimidate workers in the energy sector, lead misinformation campaigns, and stop pipeline projects and resource developments, and not a word of concern from the federal government or the NDP for that matter. The effects of this reached a new level this past week when an axe-wielding protesters injured an officer and destroyed heavy machinery and buildings on site in BC, and still not a word of concern. Is it because they support that protest? Or is it because they know that if all this foreign money were to be investigated, that their friends and supporters might be implicated by it? If they're going to use this flimsy narrative of foreign funding, then they better be consistent in their approach to it. If nothing else, after all that has been happening in Ottawa, I hope that we can learn the correct lessons. Let's listen better to Canadians, and let's keep this Liberal government in check. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Question.